My name is David Grann, and I'm a staff writer at The New Yorker. And on behalf of the magazine, I want to welcome you all to the 2013 New Yorker Festival and to this discussion on spies. Before we delve in and get to this amazing panel, which is the reason we're all here, please make sure to turn off your cell phones. I'm also told that photography is not allowed. But since this is not a classified briefing, if you plan to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag NYERFEST. The event will last 90 minutes, and I'll make sure to leave a period, at least 20 minutes at the end, for Q&A from the audience. Now, I'm incredibly honored to moderate such an extraordinary panel. Tony Mendez is a decorated American spy who worked at the CIA for 25 years. Known as a master of disguises, he specialized in carrying out exfiltration operations, which involved getting people out of hostile countries before they would be killed. In 1979, he devised and oversaw a daring plot to liberate 6 American diplomats from Iran by using the cover of creating a fake movie, which, in an unusual postmodern twist, was recently made into a movie itself, Argo. For Mendez's extraordinary heroism, he received the Intelligence Star, and if that was not enough, he is a talented author and a very successful painter. Jeff Moss is a legendary computer hacker and founder of DEF CON, the largest conference and community for hackers in the world. By the way, I believe DEF CON was named or inspired by the movie War Games. Now, Moss's experience have made him an expert in knowing the vulnerabilities of our computer and our information systems. He worked in the Information Systems Security Division at Ernst & Young, and he has since helped other companies protect their computer systems from sabotage. In 2009, he was sworn in as a member of the U.S. Homeland Security Advisory Council. Stella Rimington was a trailblazing spy and the former head of MI5. After being recruited by MI5 in 1967, she quickly rose through the ranks, working in every important branch of the agency, including in counter-espionage, counter-subversion, and counter-terrorism. In 1992, Rimington was named the head of MI5, the first woman ever to run the agency. Since retiring from the service in 1996, she has proven herself to be an equally talented writer, producing a memoir as well as several popular spy thrillers. Joe Weisberg is a former officer at the CIA, where he worked undercover in the early 1990s. After leaving the agency, he went on to become a successful novelist and television writer, producing episodes for such shows as the legal drama Damages. He has now returned to the world of espionage as the creator and producer behind the brilliant new FX series, The Americans, the show about 2 KGB operatives living in suburbia in the United States during the Cold War, has been hailed by critics and praised for its insights into the hidden world of espionage. So welcome you all. And to get things kicked off, we have a quick montage of clips.
Nobody told us that. There's that, right there on your left.
Where the hell have you been?
007, reporting for duty.
How to be a spy. A good spy has no fear.
You get nothing from us. She's trained for this. So am I.
We'll die before we'll talk.
We know how to do that.
A good spy puts himself in the mindset of the opponent.
These people can read or add. Pretty soon they're going to figure out they're 6 short of a full deck. The only way out of that city is the airport. You build new cover identities for him, you send in a Moses, he takes them out on a commercial flight.
Focus your eyes closer. That's the computer screen. It's a database of some kind.
Wow. We got something. We're in.
You don't get this, do you? Whoever's behind this, whoever's doing it, he knows us. He's one of us. He comes from the same place as Bond, the place you say doesn't exist. The shadows.
The good spy uses his... Ow! Gosh! You're too close! A good spy uses his head. Got that? It's the first one in the book.
I'm guessing this isn't strictly official.
Not even remotely.
So much for my promising career in espionage.
So, Tony, we've all seen these movies, we've all read these thrillers, these images swirl in our head about what espionage is like. How much are these popular images that we have seen and that we all carry with us are real, if any?
Well, I like to think that they're all real, and we're all still doing it. Reality is a great mirror for the fantasy world. And if, as we would usually say, if we hadn't invented this, we couldn't possibly do it because it doesn't make sense. But let's go off and do it anyway.
Now, Stella, I read somewhere you said something about, we are not right-wing nuts going around killing people like in spy movies. Is this image, what's your reaction to the popular images that we've come to see?
I think Tony's right, that behind the popular images is something, but the something behind is absolutely nothing like the thing on the top, the superficial. And I suppose the reason I made that remark was that there is a danger, it seems to me, that sometimes people actually believe the superficial, believe the presentation that they're given, and that can be actually damaging to the real stuff that's going on behind. We've got a series in Britain, which in Britain is called Spooks, but I think here it's called MI5, which indicates that here's MI5 and they're full of kind of elegant-looking women and blokes, and they're all wearing leather jackets and kind of rushing around. And they save the world every week, about 5 of them, from some terrible thing, using gadgetry that even we have never dreamt up. And I think that kind of thing can be quite damaging, actually, when MI5 is trying to present itself, as a serious organization that's trying to protect the country against serious harm. And there's just lurking in the back of people's minds, they're those guys in the leather jackets and stuff. So I think there's a danger of it, but it's not going to go away, so we have to go with it.
Now, Joe, you take great pains in your show, The Americans, to accurately portray the spying world. But I wondered if there is a method that spies use from your own experience or knowledge that we don't see in the movies. What is the method or methods that we don't see being portrayed that are important?
Well, yeah, I have to say in general about this question that I'm one of those people who's always running around saying, look, most of what espionage is really quite dull. A lot of it is not very useful or important. That's a tough thing to say when you're sitting 10 feet from Tony Mendez. I think I have to amend it to something like, what Tony Mendez does isn't that much like most espionage.
There was a program called Mission Impossible, not the Tom Cruise version, but it was a weekly television show on Thursday night or whatever. We had to assign somebody to watch that every time. Because the next thing you know, the phone is ringing. Can you do that?
Yeah, I think that's right. On the show, what we try to do is, the most of the work that happens at the CIA in human intelligence operations is about recruiting and running spies, right? I mean, you try to meet people, recruit them, manipulate them, and get them to give you secrets. And what we wanted to do on the show was show more of that on television, show what the human dimension of it is. But if you just do that, even that can get kind of dull. So we're trying to mix that up and at least get some of that in there.
Now, Jeff, I don't think too many of us are in this work, and I don't think our parents were encouraging us and saying, I think you really should become a hacker or a covert agent. And so I was wondering, how old were you when you started hacking, and how did you get into this into this realm?
Well, I wanted to be a hacker much sooner than I became a hacker.
And how old were you? I mean,
I
we're
was
talking
probably
young. You look
12.
young now, but you were really young then.
I was about 12 when I wanted to, and I didn't actually meet real hackers to show me until I was probably about 14 or 15. So I was on the other side, right? I'm trying to meet the people that have the knowledge, because there was no Google or Amazon. You couldn't just read a book on hacking. There wasn't such a book. So you had to go find other people to pass on the knowledge. And unfortunately, that world was full of a lot of people that didn't know what they were talking about. So they'd pass on a lot of bogus information. And it took you a long time to figure out what was true and what wasn't.
What was not.
Yeah.
Now, Tony, you worked as an illustrator and a graphic artist. You didn't just, how did you then wind up in the CIA? It seems like a strange leap from graphic artist to covert ops in Iran.
Another strange leap. I was an artist illustrator working in Denver, Colorado. I was 25. I had a wife and 3 children. I went to the office one day and saw an ad for artists to work overseas with the U.S. Navy. I went to an interview. I submitted some samples. And the fellow who was interviewing me looked at me and said, son, this is not the Navy. He put a bottle of Jim Beam up on the table, had his suspenders and shirt, floppy brimmed hat, and he proceeded to tell me about this artist job that he was supposed to fill, and couldn't figure out what it was really all about. So I read his recruitment guide, Top Secret Document, and I realized that if I was an artist doing this kind of work on my own and got caught, I would end up in federal prison. But since it was the CIA, which I had no idea what they did, I walked in the door as a forger counterfeiter, and 25 years later, much intrigue in between, I left for retirement, so you're supposed to know.
Now, Stella, you went to India with your husband then, and what? You got a tap, a whisper? What happened?
Well, my first career was as a historical archivist, but I come from an era where women were not really supposed to work much after they got married, and certainly after they had children. So I got married, and one day my husband came home and said that he'd got a posting. He was in the diplomatic service, got a posting to India. So I thought, great, this is the point at which I give up work altogether and go off and become a wife and mother. So we went off on a 3-week sail to India, which is how British diplomats went to their overseas postings in those days. And I began to get rather bored as a diplomatic wife, running jumble sales and coffee mornings and that kind of thing. And one day, somebody sidled up to me in the British High Commission compound and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Psst, do you want to be a spy?"
So there was a tap.
Well, it wasn't
I was
quite
kidding.
It wasn't quite like that. What he said was, "I've got a job as a part-time clerk typist. Would you like to take it on?" And I said, "Well, I can't type." But it didn't seem to matter, because what he was the small MI5 office that existed in the British High Commission in New Delhi in those days, and he was looking for some clerical help. So I got employed. You know, being respectable, obviously, as the wife of a diplomat was far more important than that I couldn't actually type. So I started this job as a part-time clerk typist and ended up as Director General of MI5.
What did you type?
I was just typing his letters home, but it was a great time to be in India. It was really the height of the Cold War. India was where East met West. The place was full of spies from our side of the divide and their side of the divide. And what MI5's office in those days was trying to do was find out who the spies were on both sides, report back, help the Indians with their security, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, you know, I'd been reading Kipling's Kim, and I thought, this is a great game. This is fantastic. So when my husband got posted back to London, I thought, I'm not going to go back to being a historical archivist. I'm going to join this outfit, and I did.
And you did.
So that's the beginning of my career.
Now, Joe, your story's a little bit different, right? Nobody approached you.
I was walking around waiting for the tap.
Right. So what happened? So you went? What? You went to find them? What?
Yeah, no, I was at Yale too. I was like, isn't this where it happens? Don't
Skull and Bones? Come on, tell secrets.
Yeah, I finally gave up, and I looked them up in the phone book. And I'm not kidding. They're listed, Central Intelligence Agency. I called up. I said, can you send me a job application? Is that something that happens? Yeah. And by then, it was about 1988. They did. They would send you, got a huge package in the mail with like a 30-page thing to fill out, every place you've ever lived, practically everyone you've ever known. I mean, you really haven't seen a job application like this. Yeah. Everyone you're related to. And I sent it in, and I waited and waited and waited, and finally got a call to go to a place, an office sort of like Tony's describing, where you meet a guy who's sitting there. Exactly. Yeah, with his boots up, and have a conversation, and then went to a local university for a test, testing all your knowledge of the world. I stayed up the whole night before studying the globe because I didn't know any geography where any country was. And sure enough, the first thing on the test was fill out a blank map with every country. So I aced it, but I would have failed it if I didn't stay up the night before. And then like a year and a half for the security clearance, and then finally got hired.
So what compelled you? Were you she had read Kim? Were you filled with these images? Was it the romance? Had you read Le Carré? I mean, what was it that?
It was all Le Carré. It really was. It was starting at 12 years old too. All Le Carré, and everybody said that's what it's really like. So I believed it. This is what it's really like. I look back now and I think, why did that seem appealing? Because if you read Le Carré as an adult, it seems that's horrible and depressing and lonely. But I also sort of understand it, that you had to be smart and intelligent, and you were sort of, in a weird way, if you're smiley, you're kind of above it all, pulling the strings, and in some weird disconnected way, I see that appealed to that kind of lonely, weird kid. That's something I would want to do. So I hadn't gotten over it. I hadn't,
Now, Tony, you were known as the master of disguises, and someone who could forge any document, which in your best known case was integral in saving several lives, and I'm sure in others that we don't know about. How do you go about, what are the forensics? How do you go about doing what you call an identity transformation, either in the Argo case or in another case?
Well, the identity transformation is the whole ball of wax when you're talking about clandestine activity. There's no way to get out of your armchair in Washington and end up in Moscow without penetrating a couple borders and telling somebody a lie. So that's where it starts. It's a scenario. Then you start adding the pieces to it and the practical problems, and you'll end up with about 20 different experts that work on the piece of this kind of operation. We had the best linguists that you could find, but they had to be able to fall into the role and play the role of a foreign persona. So that would take a really good language person, area of studies, and so forth. But when I reported in the Office of Technical Services, where a lot of identity transformation is done, I was entering into the process that was necessary at the time to move our people clandestinely. And we were able to do that well. We not only were able to defeat the KGB's very sophisticated counterintelligence surveillance using disguise techniques, we were also able to penetrate any border in the world. We set out to create a recipe for each border and have that recipe on the shelf and up to date.
And so, I read, just as an example, and I don't know if this is true, but that you once even transformed an African American and an Asian into two Caucasians so they could meet in Laos or something. Could you how does that happen? I mean, just physically, literally, how do you do that?
That was the beginning of what I was into, was that case. I was in Southeast Asia, in Laos, The city of Incheon, which is on the Mekong, was a neutralist capital, and it was the depths of the Cold War. We had a problem of clandestine activity in a town which was virtually a fishbowl of espionage. It's a small town. We had, I think my first trip there was to prepare 26 disguises for the people who were working there. And what they were doing is, these people that were working there from the other side were trying to figure out what the status of Laos was going to be, since we were in a downturn of the Vietnam War. What are they going to do? So that's a classic intelligence question. What are the intentions of the enemy? Plans and intentions, that's where the gold is. In order to get those plans and intentions from Laos, the minutes of the cabinet meeting, the day that you had the meeting, somebody's going to have to expose themselves slightly. And the problem there was the internal target, the agent, was a national figure. He was the foreign minister. And when they had their meeting, the cabinet meeting, we then had to somehow make contact with that guy, find out what the plans for the day were. The problem was everybody was out at the same time in the evening. It's a national pastime, and the cars and putt-putts and whatever were circling around the circle in the middle of town, a miniature version of the Arch de Triomphe. So it was so busy, agents getting into their handler's car and out, that the Russian agent would get into the Chinese car. Well, we didn't want our guy out there swirling around without some protection. So what we came up with was just a practical solution, and that was the means for our guy to be able to disappear and reappear only when we had him into a safe place. So I took a black American who was the case officer of this case and made him into a Rex Harrison. Having trouble remembering the name of the movie star. What I ended up doing is establishing a relationship with Hollywood so that I could take a measurement and photographs of one of these fellows that were of interest and send it to Hollywood and get back Victor Mature, who is an actor, kind of B-type actor, and Rex Harrison. And the first time we put this together in a car, the thing that we feared the most when in one of these meetings took place, and that was that we went around the corner and ran right into a roadblock. But what had happened is our two Caucasians had done their thing, and the roadblock was not a problem.
Wow. Now, Stella, I hope you, Joe, and you guys, so you're all taking notes for the novel and the, by the way, because Stella, your career is really interesting because it spanned so many critical kind of chapters in world history, and in terms of changes of dangers and threats. You've covered, from IRA bombings to the Lockerbie bombing, and I was curious if your methods change depending on your enemy, and depending on, do you approach an Al-Qaeda cell the same way you would an IRA or some other group?
Well, you have to remember I'm a counter spy, so my job is to stop people like Tony, except they're our friends, but people like Tony from the other side of whatever it is, from being successful. So MI5's job is to try and protect the country against any threats to our national security, whatever they are. And you're right that during my career, they changed quite radically, because I joined, as I said, at the height of the Cold War, where the main threat to our security came from the Soviet Union and their allies and their efforts at espionage in our country and the countries of the West, and subversion as they tried to undermine Western democracies by spreading world communism. And the way we tried to deal with that was in conjunction with our allies in the United States and in other parts of the world, our old established allies. We tried to identify as many of the operatives, of the KGB officers or whatever it was, as we possibly could. We tracked them as they moved round the world. We informed each other. We studied their techniques. We studied their embassies where they had their residentura. And we aimed to know as much as we possibly could about those outfits, the way they worked, etc. And that was the way we dealt with espionage. When, during, I suppose, the early 1970s and then on into the 80s and ever onwards, terrorism began to raise its head, as far as we were concerned, firstly from the situation in Northern Ireland with the IRA, who during the 80s became, I think, the world's best, well-resourced and most professional terrorist organization, thanks largely to Colonel Gaddafi, who supplied them with large quantities of arms and explosives in a number of ships, some of which we didn't actually intercept, some we did. When we got around to dealing with the IRA, we were having to deal with them in a slightly different way, but basically the techniques were the same, because the IRA was an organized structure, like the KGB. It had a headquarters, it had members, it had a structure, it had various professional units, and you could study them and get to know who they were, where they were, what their aims and objectives were. It's all about infiltrating these things, and we managed to infiltrate the IRA really quite effectively. We recruited a number of them, and they were prepared to tell us what was going on, etc. So the techniques were basically the same. It was about understanding your enemy, keeping your record so that you could refer back what you learned to what you already knew, and preventing, basically. Because the thing to remember about British intelligence is differently from American intelligence. British intelligence organizations have got no executive powers. We don't have the power of arrest. We don't have a military wing. We can't kill people. We rely closely on the police service. And differently from the United States, we regard terrorism as a crime. So we aim to arrest terrorists and put them in court and try them and hopefully get them in prison. So our sort of methods of working are slightly different from in the United States. So that was dealing with the IRA kind of terrorism. But when today's sort of terrorism came along, which it did just before I retired, you were facing a very different thing, of course. You were facing something where if it had a structure, a headquarters, an organization, it was not within our reach or anybody's reach. We knew very little about the way they organized themselves. We knew very little fundamentally about what each of the individuals actually wanted. And we were facing something new, which was the era of suicide bombers. So it became a very, very different thing. And that's why technology has now come to be much more important, I think, in the counter-terrorist world than it ever was in early days, partly because the world's become a much more sophisticated technological place, and therefore we need to go where the terrorists go, but partly, of course, because the traditional ways of gathering intelligence are not so available anymore.
Joe, I was curious, in the Americas, you decided to set it in the 1980s and not contemporaneous. Was that because you thought there was a clarity or a simplicity to the nature of spying then, or a kind of clear morality, or what was the reasoning behind that?
The show was initially inspired by the events of 2010 when a group of Russian illegals were arrested in the United States. And I got a call from the presidents of DreamWorks Television who said, "Do you want to base a show on this?" And I said, "Yeah, that seems like a great idea." And then I started wandering around the streets and thinking, I don't know, the whole thing's kind of dull, really. And it took me about 2 weeks. I don't know why it didn't take 24 hours, but it took 2 weeks. And I thought, oh, you got to put it back in the Cold War. And then suddenly it's exciting. And then you have Ronald Reagan. It was really Ronald Reagan. We wanted to have Ronald Reagan screaming about the evil empire and the Soviets wanting to destroy us. So that was really the reason to put it back there.
And how much of what you learned at the CIA in terms of stagecraft is obsolete now? Speaking a little bit to what Stella.
I think the truth is I don't know. I wonder all the time about that. I mean, obviously, you can now take a computer and communicate with people halfway around the world and don't have any, you can do it that way, but a lot of things I read and hear about suggest that people still want to use the old tradecraft for a lot of things. If you're running an agent, you want to talk to them and have personal contact, or you can't have any relationship. Running an agent depends on a relationship. So my guess is that the two coexist side by side these days.
Now, Jeff, I think we chatted a little bit beforehand, and I was kind of amazed because I was starting to say, well, how can I kind of integrate? We have spies and hackers a little bit different. But when you started to tell me a little bit about the tradecraft that you use and subterfuge, tell me a little bit. I mean, you even have a name, Dark Tangent. And I wondered how do you use this subterfuge in what you do?
Well, it's interesting being on a panel of professional spies, not being one, how much overlap there is. And I think that's why I was fascinated as a kid. Of course, we read probably the same spy books, and except as a hacker in the early days, it's very important to hide your identity from other hackers. And your parents, and your and law enforcement or whatever. And in the early days, it was you were trying to break into systems to get access for knowledge. There was no money online. There was nothing to steal. It was purely an exploratory adventure. But to do that, you had to. I alluded to it earlier. You needed to meet other people who could tell you, this is how the phone system works, or this is how, and you didn't know if you could trust them, and so you took on an identity. And then everything you did was with that identity, or you could have multiple identities for different things. And if you ever made a mistake, or you pissed someone off, or you made an enemy, you could burn that identity, not use that anymore, and as long as nobody could tie that identity to your true identity, you could just kind of close that chapter off in your life. It was like a mulligan, you got a do-over. But the longer you had an identity, the more energy you'd invested in it. The hacking handle. So I've had this handle, the Dark Tangent, for about 20 years. I've had other ones, but that's my main identity, and I've invested the most amount of energy in that. Then what would happen is you would talk to other hackers, and you would say, can I trust that guy? He's going by the handle, Dark Knight. Can I trust that?
I don't trust anyone who's named Dark Knight.
Yeah. Well, the problem is people would name themselves after popular movies. I don't know how many red dragons, blue dragons, black dragons I'd come across, but you would try to say, does anybody know that guy? And they don't know who they really are, but they know the identity, the handle. And so if anybody new came along and you didn't know who they were, and their handle was brand new and nobody knew them, you probably couldn't trust them. And so it took a long time to build up this layer of trust. And a lot of the tradecraft you do for hiding your agents, well, I didn't have a government protecting me. So everything I did, you were doubly paranoid about everything. Payphones, you never used your home phone. Other hackers would try to get dirt on other hackers, and then it would sort of like, if you knew their real identity, you could sort of control them because you could tell their parents what they're up to. If you got in a hacker war with someone and you knew where they lived, that was it. People would play all kinds of really evil pranks on each other. So you went to extraordinary lengths to protect your identity. Like your phone number on your cell phone with AT&T, you have to give them your social security number. So if you give me your phone number, I can get your social security number from AT&T. Now I can get your credit report. Now I know where you live. If I get a picture of you in your car, I got your driver's license plate. Now I've got your address and I know who you are. So if you're trying to remain confidential, you have to go to extraordinary lengths. And this is just for hacking. There's no national secrets involved. Can only imagine what these guys had to go through.
Now, the stakes, especially when it does come to national security, are incredibly high. Is there, I wonder, I just kind of throw this out, anyone can jump in, but is there a line you won't cross to get information, or is there one? Did you have some place where you said, this is too far, given how high the stakes are in protecting national security of countries?
Well, speaking personally, what we did was governed by the law. When I first joined MI5, there was no law, actually. Our intelligence services were not based on any statutory basis. It was just kind of custom and practice. By the time I left, we were surrounded by laws and oversights. And so what you did or could do were very much dependent on what the law allowed you to do. And that meant that the most intrusive forms of investigation, like intercepting people's phones, or even, by the time I left, following people around, had to be approved, usually in our case, by government ministers, though I know it's different in this country. And so, yes, you were very, very much bound around. But the point was that you actually had to demonstrate a need, and I think that's the key thing. If you can demonstrate that whoever it is that you wish to investigate in great depth is presenting or likely to present a threat to national security, then you can deploy all the panoplies of investigation. But national security agencies are very much governed by whatever laws have been put in place to control them.
And what's your view of whether agency, Tony or Stella, I think, or Joe, or in terms of whether intelligence agencies should be using methods like waterboarding and renditions?
Well, Only I'm the one who should speak on this. But I'll just toss out one thing that I noticed when I was at the CIA, that when I was there before any of this came up, the CIA was bound by a lot of very specific rules that, in a sense, I thought everybody took on faith. Of course, you didn't torture people. That barely even needed to be said. But there were also more specific things like, you didn't use journalists, for example. That was against the rules. You didn't recruit journalists as spies. These were directives within the agency. Then there were ones that came out that were from outside of the agency, like you didn't assassinate people. But it turns out these weren't exactly laws either. These were presidential directives, which are sort of laws, but sort of not. And what I discovered when I was there was that every one of these things, if you really wanted to do it, you could get an exception. Right? And that came as a big discovery to me, that any one of these things might have actually been going on if there was a real need to do it. So,
or you can just change the name of it.
Change the
I want to come back to some of the bigger questions, but just really, I want to just touch a little bit on how spying affected you personally. And Joe, living a cover means lying to those you love. How difficult was that for you?
When I was applying for the agency, I had originally wanted to be an analyst, and then as I sort of went to the agency, visited, met the different people there, I decided I'd be more interested in being in operations. And then as the process, I mentioned, it was a very long process to get in, I started thinking about it, and I thought, I'm not sure I actually can do this. I'll have to lie to everybody I know, most of my relatives. I started worrying about the psychic toll it would take. I really thought long and hard about if it was a good idea and how much, if I could handle it. And I decided what I would do is I really wanted to be a spy, and I was going to try it and see how it went. And it took 2 weeks. 2 weeks in, I just never thought about it again. I lied. I knew I had a lot of friends. My whole social life was outside of the agency. I must have lied 50 times a day, constantly, nonstop lying. I didn't care. I didn't know. I just got completely used to it. But then I was there for about 4 years, and like the day I left, I was like, whoa. I think like the stress sort of all hit me at once. But like when you're there, it just seems completely normal, and everybody there just becomes your life, and it seems like a normal thing to do.
Tony?
General Kalugan, the KGB officer, the youngest general in the KGB, he says the only rule is There are no rules. And that was just the way they operated. So yeah, there's no laws that you're necessarily breaking by assassinating somebody, but it was a presidential rule, and they have a different name for it. It's where the president speaks.
There certainly seemed to be an exception for Castro.
We will do what he says, but the journalist rule, I'm sure that was somebody's guideline. It wasn't. Well, maybe I shouldn't be so sure. My way of thinking about the assassination rule is it was sure more efficient to use a hitman than it would be to fire a cruise missile, which is what they've been thinking about doing most recently. You're going to probably have a lot of collateral damage, and you're going to kill a few kids and dogs or whatever, and it's not going to solve anything. It seems so arcane. So I have to admit that the guys in my old office that created the Predator drone kind of scenarios, they were doing us a favor. It's not very moral to do that, but it's sure a lot more simple to do it that way. And guess what? Nobody gets killed as readily by accident. What do you think?
Can I just establish a difference here between British intelligence and American? Which is that British intelligence does not kill people.
What's happening to the Special Alliance here?
The Special Alliance, is about exchanging information, but it's not about exchanging murder. So British intelligence doesn't kill people. If there's killing to be done, it's done by the military, and that's a clear distinction. If, for example, a situation arises like when we had the Iranian embassy siege in London, I think it was in the 70s, which was the first time the great British public saw the SAS operating, because what happened there was that there was a need for military action, and what happens in Britain is that the civil power hands over control to the military. And so what goes in to do any kind of killing that's necessary in order to release the hostages is the military. So we have this clear distinction, which is different in the United States. We don't have any kind of armed wing of SIS, of MI6 or of MI5. And as I said, we didn't have any police powers either. So we are a different kind of, much smaller and much more kind of focused organization.
But I don't think we call the predators killers. I think it's just
Sorry?
I don't think we call the drones, we don't refer to them as being killers. They're an instrument of war. Fits more to your mold than some other mold.
Stella, when you were head of MI5, it wasn't you had your cover blown, but you had your picture suddenly released. I think you were the first head of MI5 to have your photo, and I was just a little bit curious about how that affected you and your children. What was the fallout from that?
It was quite considerable. I was, until I became Director General, no head of any of our intelligence agencies had ever been a public figure. In fact, for a very long time, British intelligence was sort of concealed completely. Nobody knew who they were, what they did. And even the government, until I think it was about the 1980s, didn't even admit that MI6, our Foreign Intelligence Service, existed. So there was this whole sort of blanket thing. And we all went around, with cover stories, etc., and told our neighbours that we worked for the Home Office or something. And then one day I was told, you're going to be the next Director General, and by the way, the government's decided that on appointment, your name is going to be made public. And I thought, my God, this is going to be a sensation, not only because it was the first time any announcement like that had been made, but also because I was a woman. And of course it was. What happened was that this announcement was made, and the government, of course, doing things kind of half-bakedly. No minister was going to go on the television and say, the reason we've decided to announce that is so-and-so. So what happened was that our media immediately set out to find out who is this woman, you know, what she looked like, where is she, etc. And they quite easily found out where we lived, which was in an ordinary London street, because I'd always lived there, just relying on my anonymity, told the neighbours I worked for the Home Office, etc. And I had 2 daughters, one of whom was at home and the other one was at university. And all of a sudden, we had to face this huge press furore. We have a tabloid press in Britain, which is not the most subtle. And their headlines were housewife, super spy. And there was another one, which I hated, which was mother of 2 gets tough with terrorists. You know, there I was. They put me back exactly where women should be, which was in the kitchen, in front of the kitchen sink, you know, housewife, mother of 2. So that's how it started off, actually, and it was not easy. But what we decided, myself and my senior colleagues decided that the moment had come that we should be more open about what we actually did, because this myth had got around, you know, we don't need you intelligence services anymore. The Cold War's over, you're all about spying, we don't need you. But we knew that we were needed even more because terrorism was really on the rise. So we took a decision that we were going to form what we described as an openness strategy. And we published a booklet about what a security service has to do in a democracy and broadly how it does it. I went on television and I gave a sort of lecture which was entitled, Is There a Conflict Between Security and Democracy? Which of course is a very current issue actually, and it was an issue in those days too. And, you know, all this received a certain amount of quite serious attention from our serious newspapers, but one journalist wrote that I had very large ears. And that these must be very useful in covert. So we had to cope with that as well. But I think in the end, you know, being more open was the right thing to be. We positioned ourselves, because we'd never said anything about anything in the old days, and everybody had all kinds of stories about how we went around killing old ladies and, you know, spying on CND and all this sort of stuff. None of it was true. So, yeah, it wasn't easy. And for my daughters, it was particularly not easy, because the one who was at university was stalked by the newspapers, you know, shoving a microphone in front of her face saying, what's it like having a famous mum? And she didn't know what it was like or what to say. So that was bad. And the other one, who was at home, she had a little car that was registered in a false name. And she was scared stiff if she went out in the evening. What if she had an accident or got stopped by the police? And she used to say, now, just tell me again, Mum, who am I?
Oh, wow.
And that taught her how to live covertly, because in the end we had to sell our house and effectively move underground and live covertly for the rest of my time as DG. So that was the result of being more open suddenly.
Now, Stella talked a little bit earlier, and I want to kind of loop back to that a little bit about how technology is changing espionage. And I thought, Jeff, I'd kind of start with you in terms of how vulnerable are our systems to this kind of new form of espionage, which really did not once exist, where you can use computers and internet.
Yeah, it's interesting. The technology now is the things you used to see in the old Mission Impossible is starting to become reality. And I have an acquaintance who does a lot of work for the State Department, but he does a lot of work trying to identify privacy rights, human rights, and he ends up meeting a lot of civil rights abusers in other countries. And what he does is, let's say he's meeting with someone, he always buys their glass when they're done having food. And he buys the glass, he makes sure he's the last to leave, and he buys the glass from the restaurant. He takes it home, and then he scans the fingerprints off the glass, and he 3D prints them, and he makes fingerprint gloves. And so now he can leave fingerprints behind of anybody he's ever met. And I was secretly hoping we'd have glasses here for the water. And I was sorely disappointed when I saw these plastic bottles. But that was something that would have been cost prohibitive, 5 years ago. Now it costs them, $30 or something in supplies. And so the world we live in now is all that spy tech is real, right? Little bugs you can leave behind now are throwaway. In the old days, you'd have to plant a bug, and you're like, well, that's $400. And how many of these things can I? Now you take a whole handful of them, you throw them up in the ceiling. And now it's a nightmare for the counterintelligence guy to find them all. Well, he's found 12. Is there a 13th? And so it's really becoming complicated. And then you layer on top of that, every one of us is carrying around a personal tracking and locating device with a built-in bug, our cell phones. And not just the governments, but criminal organizations spend a lot of time figuring out how to break into our phones and turn them into listening devices. And so, and who here is going to want to go into a business meeting and leave their phone, turn off their phone and leave it in a metal box outside of the board meeting? Well, nobody really does that. So essentially, if you really care, if somebody really cares about you, they can get into your device and listen to all of your conversations. So that's the world we're moving into, with less and less, more and more transparency for the bad guys if they're interested in you.
Tony, is it more, data exfiltration instead of human exfiltration, do you think, today?
I don't know the answer to that. I would not be surprised that we've used our first biometric in that way. We referred to the data angle in the use of alternate identities as a biometric, because there's usually an interface of some sort that is a biometric. There are several ways to solve the problems of high technology, border crossings, that kind of thing. We've always been working the problem during World War II, where you judged the efficacy of a person who was using a false identity to go through a choke point. You had to always be looking for the thing that's going to catch you up, and come up with a way of beating it. So I mentioned World War II because there was a document that we made that was rather high tech for the time. It was, the printing on it was at least as good as currency, which is the highest level in traditionally, and every time we sent an agent out to the east from the west, the fellow would not come back. So we figured we had something wrong with that document. There's something attached to it that attaches itself to me. Well, when they finally did a full examination, they found that this document typically on our agents would have rusty staples. And what was the reason for the rusty staple? It turned out that the rusty staple was really the false document made by the Germans. And the reason for that is the case was going down in Germany, and the real document had rusty staples, but the false document, the one that was counterfeit, and it had no rust. Turned out it was a cultural issue. German spies wouldn't use rusty tables. I mean, just because they're neat. But that's the true story.
Well, Stella or Joe, or you touched a little bit about this, why technology surveillance is more important. Is human intelligence still as important as it once was? Is signal intelligence more important now, given the day and age we live in and all the technology? Anybody, Stella?
I think, from my understanding, human intelligence is still just as important as it used to be. And I mean, I think that you still get the best intelligence from the human being, the agent, who is in the right place and can tell you, not only can report what's being thought, but he can tell you minute by minute what's going on. And he can also give you kind of character studies of the people he's with, so that you can get a kind of rounded picture of what's going on in, be it the terrorist cell or the hostile intelligence service or wherever it is that he's reporting from. I'm quite sure that technology is an absolutely essential co-part of this, because that can fill you in on other things as well, but it can never give you, I don't think it can give you that kind of personal feel of the setup, who is most influential, who's pulling the strings, etc. So I think the two go hand in hand, but I think it's a mistake to think that technology means we no longer need human intelligence.
All the technology does is creates a new set of questions. So you send your satellites up and you take pictures of what they're doing over time, and you have an idea that they're building something. But you still have to get the person in the facility and in the meetings where they make the decision to take whatever steps they've been taking.
Well, and the bad guys know that your location can be tracked and your conversations listened into and your email read. So I think the technology is going to catch the really dumb ones. But it's absolutely essential. You have to understand, well, who's trustworthy, who's not, what's the motivations, what are they thinking? And you're never, unless you are a serial blogger and you write everything in your head down and send it out to be read by an agency, you're still going to need the human side of it.
Yeah, to interpret, as Tony says, what you're reading. Yeah.
I think I believe that the importance of human intelligence tends to be overblown. That the idea of these human assets out there providing really important intelligence is largely mythical. There may have been a few, and there may still be a few, but there aren't many. I'm working on a theory based on no actual experience that the same may be true for electronic surveillance as well, but I haven't got there yet.
Oh.
I know of human intelligence sources, for example, in the IRA, that have actually been able to give a running commentary about when and where the bomb is coming on, where it's going to be planted, and the moment at which it's going to be set off, which has enabled us, and working closely with the police in the UK, to get there first so that we can not only stop the bomb going off, but arrest the whole team that are planting it in order that we can get them in court and get them in prison. So human intelligence, certainly in my experience, can be a very immediate thing, which I don't think technology, even today perhaps, could achieve. So I don't think you should run it down. It's got to be the right bloke in the right place.
I don't know if the British have the same problem that I think the Americans have. And like I said, I think there have been a few and may still be a few. But what the Americans do is collect human intelligence so broadly, in my opinion, that they have this kind of enormous stable of assets providing this enormous amount of human intelligence that I think is mostly without value. So I don't dismiss all of it or say that there's none of value, or that the CIA hasn't also had a few like that, but that they are this sort of tiny little narrow sliver of this sort of vast network mostly providing nothing.
I think there are some advantages in being small, you know,
yeah, right.
From my point of view.
Right.
And so you can focus more.
Right.
Now, in the age where we have WikiLeaks, There's been various disclosures, Snowden being the most recent. And I wondered, in this age when so much information is getting out there, how does that affect intelligence gathering, which has always relied on secrecy?
Sorry, who did you ask? Anybody?
Yeah, anybody. Yeah. Jump.
I'm just shocked this hasn't happened earlier. I mean, it's pretty amazing that they've built these systems that hold all these secrets, and they don't know who's accessed them or what's been accessed, or are there 10 Snowdens out there and this is the only guy that's come forward? They can't answer that.
Theoretically.
You know,
Well,
that's really scary.
What struck me about both the WikiLeaks and the Snowden cases was the amount of access that these young people had to what was apparently, you know, the crown jewels. And I couldn't quite understand what had happened to American security. For example, in the case of Manning, that he, you know, as a young guy, had access to this immense amount of information, and moreover, that he was able to copy it and take it out without anybody apparently noticing. And the same thing appears to be in the case with Snowden. So there's something there that I don't fully understand about you know, American security. But, I mean, the other thing I think is important is that, I mean, it seems to me obvious that as technology gets more complicated, and as the people who want to do us harm do use technology, you know, to communicate, to plot, et cetera, our intelligence services have got to be able to go where the bad guys are. And the worry about WikiLeaks and Snowden and everything is that reading some of the newspapers, particularly in the UK, you would think that the main threat to our security came from our intelligence and security services, you know, trying to intrude into our private lives, read all our emails, And we all know that's not true. I mean, what our intelligence and security services, who are, in my experience, a group of, you know, hard-working, serious-minded and loyal people, what they are trying to do is to stop horrible things happening to us, such as happened recently in Kenya. But they need to, in my understanding, I mean, my feeling is that they need to be able to explain themselves a bit more than they are doing, so that, you know, the world is not over-convinced by scare stories, by leakers, et cetera, saying this is all shocking and they're reading all your emails and we have no private life. Somehow, our intelligence services have got to be able to respond and explain more. And, you know, I think that perhaps is the next step. And people have to be more convinced that in using these powers, which I believe are essential, that they are being properly overseen. And somebody needs to be out there kind of convincing the great British public, in my case, you know, that these things are essential and are being properly used. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect.
Well, this may get, again, back to the difference between your smaller and possibly more likely to be overseen intelligence service and our larger and impossible to oversee intelligence service, that while ours is also doing exactly what you said, which is very noble, vital, and important work protecting us from a lot of threats, it's also doing a lot of stuff that really can't be explained. And that when the world is now looking at a lot of the Snowden revelations are infuriating people all over the world, and there's no explaining it. There's no going to the people around the world that are being spied on and saying, hey, I have great explanations for all of this that once you understand it, you won't be upset anymore. What the intelligence services are doing is damaging our national security in very real ways, and in ways that maybe, you know, there's just no other way to look at it. It's doing actual damage. And maybe that there's no way to deal with that except to stop doing a lot of those things and to ask yourself, are the things we're doing, are we getting any benefit from it? So if we're spying on country X, Y, and Z, and those countries might have been neutral or might have had a positive attitude towards the United States government, and now that we're spying on them, they're really turning more against us, and you look at the damage to our national security, and you say, if on the other side, if we were spying on them, could we possibly be getting anything from spying on those countries that would enhance our national security? And the answer is, I don't know. I can't think of anything we could get from spying on that country that would actually help us. It may be that we actually might need to think of some more of a sea change in how we approach espionage.
Yeah, the question I have is it costs money to collect all this email, for example, or telephone conversations. And you've got to store it, and you've got to process it, and you've got to invent all the science around parsing it. And let's say we're spending X billions of dollars to do this. What benefit do we get? And at some point, the business person in me wants to understand, well, if I'm the business guy, it's like, well, we're spending $50 billion and we're getting 80% of the traffic. How many bad guys is that catching? And is it realistic to try to capture 100% of traffic? Does that catch 2 more bad guys for double the money? Because you get that point of diminishing returns. So where does this logically lead us to? It leads us to spending an infinite amount of money to record everything and to catch 4 more bad guys. Can we take that money and spend it better on human intelligence or some other area? And I never get the impression that there's been this sort of cost-benefit analysis. I'm sure there's an infinite number of good things we could spend the money on, but getting an extra 2% doesn't seem...
But you're a technological guy, and can you tell us how, for example, to pick up those vital things we need to prevent something like, you know, the shopping mall in Kenya being attacked, without picking up all this other stuff? I mean, that seems to me, that's a technical question. You ought to be able to say, you know, don't have all that stuff, just go zoink in here.
Well, and the problem in that is the people, the really bad people, I mean, they're passing notes to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
So until you invent the note reader robot or something.
But they're not only doing that. Before they get to the note bit, they're communicating with each other by technological means.
The part that scares me is the future of facial recognition. And how do you have an undercover agent if everybody on Facebook's ever had their pictures been tagged? How do the police agents, you know, if you're a police officer and you're going to do an undercover crime thing, and before they let you into the drug house, they take a picture of you and it goes to Facebook and says, that guy's name's really Joe, and he graduated, and it's...
But don't fall too much in love with facial recognition. I'll very quickly summarize my understanding. There's a James Bond movie in 1985, A View to Kill. A terrorist comes into the airport. He's approaching the choke point at immigration. And across the screen flashes his complete dossier before he even gets to the place where they're checking on him. I got a call the next morning. And the call was from Director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, kind of an eccentric fellow. And the question was, can we do that? And the answer was, no, sir. Shouldn't we be able to do that? Yes, sir. So all these years later, they're still working on it. But I'm able to sit in meetings where I meet some people who might be doing that and ask them how it's going. And I get, I've gone to conferences recently where the people that are hiring me to come to their conference so I can lend credibility to their facial recognition machine, which doesn't work. And the point is, in 2003, November issue of National Geographic magazine, the cover story is about facial recognition and other means for surveilling people. They came to me and asked me if I would take on facial recognition as a test bed to see if I could beat it without making anything, just using a felt tip marker and a box of Kleenex. 86% of the time I was able to do it.
Where'd the Kleenex go?
in my
Oh,
mouth.
your cheek.
It's called a plumper. Plumper. And if you've ever watched The Godfather with Marlon Brando as the Godfather, he's got his chin like this. Well, with a bit of Kleenex, you can make what you need to alter those anchor points that are in your face and other places, which are the things you measure and develop a matrix of, so you can decide whether this is that person or this. And I'm able to move them still, but somebody will figure out how to nail them down tighter. So I'd keep working on it. Just as an aside, the comment about American security practices, the CIA has been damaged. Our security has been seen to be flawed because we base our methods on trust. We vet the officer or the agent, and therefore, once they've been vetted and judged reliable, we have to trust them, and that's a problem. But there's some good reasons to do that.
I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. I think, why don't we get ready to do that? I have a few more, which I can come back to at the end, but I want to make sure that I know all of you will have your own questions and be eager to ask them. So I think we have microphones, and I think that person will come around and just find them. Is that how it's going to work? And just make sure you speak clearly. Just raise your hand and somebody will come to you.
Okay, so I've been handed the microphone. I guess I have the first. Each of you possesses a really remarkable skill set. And have you ever used it or been tempted to use it for less lofty personal issues?
With great power comes great responsibility.
My wife is here someplace. She can tell a couple stories.
I think we see some discretion right now.
Hello? Hi. You alluded to it a little bit earlier about the cost-benefit analysis, but to do that, it seems that we would have to have what we would consider an acceptable level of risk. At kind of the higher levels of intelligence gathering and national security, is there a discussion of whether, so we can't reach a zero risk. Life carries risk, living has risks. Do we have an idea of what an acceptable level of risk is and how much we're willing to spend on it? One example that my friends and I go on about is in the TSA airport scenario, if it takes 30 seconds to take off your shoes and 6 million people fly in America every year, that's costing 2,000 man-years of lost human time. And so how many lives do we have to save to make that worthwhile? And is that kind of discussion happening?
I think that protective security at airports, personally, I feel, has got somewhat detached from an understanding of the threat. I think what happens is that, obviously, when something some threat is discovered, like, for example, in the UK a few years ago, when they detected that these people were trying to blow up a series of aircraft by use of liquids, injecting stuff into liquids, then none of us were allowed to take liquids on planes. Well, that was fair enough because that was closely associated with a genuine threat. My sense, though, is that nothing is ever removed. We pile physical security on top of physical security, but we never look at it again and say, well, that particular threat is now dealt with, we can take that away. So the danger is that we are all going to, have to spend hours and hours and hours taking all our clothes off at the airport because the thing is not properly tied in with an understanding of the threat. And I think this is a problem that needs to be addressed, because I agree with you, there's a huge waste of time and resources in trying to protect against things that are highly unlikely ever to happen.
The TSA recently wanted to allow small pocket knives back through security. And they'd done this cost-benefit analysis, and they realized that so much energy was spent removing small toenail clippers and stuff that the inspectors were missing the big picture. They're training their brains to find little pocket knives, and they were not looking to find the bigger things. And so the analysis was it'll actually improve security because it'll remove this huge class of time wasters. Except the public had a big uproar that, oh my God, you're going to allow these pocket knives back on board. And so it's this trap. You mentioned once something's added, it's almost impossible to remove. Yeah. And the reason is, if you remove something and a bad occurrence occurs, you'll be remembered as the guy that let it happen.
Exactly.
If you add it on, there's no harm, right? Hey, look, we tried. We kept it on there. It's not my fault. Look how smart the bad guys were, but we banned the knives. And so you've got this institutional system which allows for things to be added, nothing to ever be removed.
Hi, my question is for Jeff. I think everyone has the rest of you have a pretty clear alliance, at least I would think so. But with Jeff, I'm curious because you have to kind of walk this fine line where, you have to keep one foot in and one foot kind of legal, I should say. So I'm curious how you kind of maintain trust in both. Obviously you have to keep your handle and the associations you make using that handle. You have to keep those alliances as well, I would assume. So how do you?
Yeah, I was really lucky in that I grew up in the generation where there really weren't any laws against any of the computer hacking back then. Just no laws had been created, so I never actually did anything technically illegal. That was lucky later on in life. But nowadays, if you're a kid and you're growing up, there's all kinds of really crazy mandatory sentencing guidelines around this stuff. I think you'll get in more trouble hacking someone's computer than you will driving over somebody drunk and killing them, right? I mean, so what happens is people don't understand, they fear what they don't understand, and the law overcompensates. And so now you can spend more time in jail for not killing anyone than for killing someone accidentally. And so I'm waiting for the pendulum to swing back. I'm hoping it's going to swing back. And and so when I grew up with a whole class of people who are all interested in information security, before there were jobs in it or careers in it, luckily now you stay in touch with everybody, and you stay in touch with these young hackers that are inventing these new ways to break into systems. And so you keep your foot in it that way. But what's happened is the criminality has now become so institutionalized. Like, there's organized crime groups with millions and millions of dollars of budgets and 20 people development teams, and their whole job is just to develop one way of stealing money from a bank. I mean, in my day, it was like lone hackers, maybe 3 or 4 would get together. Nobody had a budget, and it was all done on spare time. Nowadays, you're up against real teams with real resources. And and so those groups I'm never going to be able to talk to. So you do end up becoming more abstract from what the real bad guys are up to. Where in the early days it was simple. You'd ask around, what have you heard? But the bad guys, the criminals are so good now, they're not leaking really what they're up to until they do it.
My question is for all of you. you all come from very different backgrounds, but where do you see your individual responsibilities? Is it a matter of protecting your citizens against all threats, from foreign threats? Where do you see what you're supposed to do? Most people have a very clear idea of what their job is, what they're supposed to accomplish. What do you see your goal as being? And do you think other people would objectively agree with that, or do they just not understand why that's your goal?
Well, I'll go first. So I sort of go by two dictums. One is I love my country, so obviously my country gets first priority. But second, I want decision makers to have the truth, or as close to the truth as I can portray to it, or they have the facts to make an informed decision. So what bothers me the most is when decision makers make bad decisions because they have bad information. So I sort of see it as one of my missions is give the decision makers the best information they can have, and then if they screw up the decision, that's beyond me. But at least I did my best to get them the information to make an informed decision. So that's why I put in a lot of energy helping DHS, or frankly any agency of the US government. I'll advise anybody because I want them to have the best information. And if I can't get them that information, I'll find someone who can. But it drives me crazy when it's like, if only they had talked to the right people, they could have gotten the right information, we wouldn't have gone down that road.
This is hacking that you're talking about?
Yeah, information security or infrastructure protection, anything that would be useful. Because I find it's sort of like in the early days of hacking, there's so much misinformation out there, and there's so many companies selling bogus products, that, like your facial recognition system. You need somebody to go up and say, well, that's a nice product, but don't ever deploy it if lives are at stake, you know. But sometimes it's hard to get truth to decision makers because they're surrounded by people with interests that are trying to sell them something.
I'd like to know how much time, effort, and money is spent on self-scouting. Do the top agencies in the world take a look at themselves? Are we doing the right thing? Are we keeping up with the other agencies? Is that important to do as you try to move forward?
I think it is important, yeah. In my experience, the major intelligence agencies, certainly in Europe, the United States, etc., all get together frequently and compare notes and share techniques, etc., and do compare themselves in a way. But most countries organize their intelligence services slightly differently from each other. So there is no sort of carbon copying of one by the other, and no real direct comparison. But certainly throughout the world, I mean, we and the Americans would agree which intelligence services are any good and which are not, which are honest, which are not, etc. So certainly, I mean, there's a lot of interchange, and there is a lot of comparison, you might say, yes.
So I think time is running out, actually. I was hoping we'd have a little bit more time. So I want to thank you all so much for coming. And I really want to thank our incredibly distinguished panelists.